As Lather calls it, it's 1,000 tiny methodologies. Um, so, so post-qualitative research, thirdly, decenters knowledge. And you can see why I say there's a lot of touch points with decolonial thinking. So it decenters knowledge in the sense that it questions the privileging of knowledge in research. And so I don't want to go into all the debates about quantitative and qualitative research. We've all learned them very well. But it talks about privileging. And fourthly, it involves critiquing representational logic. So St. Pierre points out that representational schemas assume two things, that there's a primary uh, significant and singular reality to be found, and that language is able to accurately represent such a reality. So that there's a huge critique against that. So in the fifthly, research subjectivity becomes ecological or imperceptible. So there's an entanglement, and I will go on to talk about the work here. There's an entanglement between who we are, between the human, the non-human world, the material world, and other humans. So Lagrange depicts this sense of subjectivity as not as an atomized individual, but and one that is ecological, embedded in the material flows of the earth and cosmos, and that constitutive of these flows, making the subject imperceptible. So research is not performed on the earth, but bent by earth and its events. So we become more than the self, actually. We are connected to each other, and as I said, in the material, non-human, and animal worlds. Now, this is very interesting and very contentious, that with respect to data analysis, post-qualitative inquiry asks us to reimagine data analysis so that, for example, coding and categorizing that characterize conventional research could be overcome. And so Lather says that escaping binaries into continuums and multiplicities, new events of thinking can be materialized. Data can be relived from differing subject positions. Thinking can become creation as researchers are transformed into creative thinkers in assemblage with one another. And here being used by thought as its pleasures, and I'm still quoting from it, zigzagging through networks of difference in a non-hierarchical manner. And so finally, post-qualitative research recognizes that method is performative. In other words, we can choose methods which are transformative and methods that make possible the transformation of our context and our world. How's that starting to resonate? So I think, what may be useful for us to think about before I go into looking at what runs through as a golden thread are three questions, which comes from a paper by Thiele, Thiele, written this year. And the questions they ask in a conversation is, how does your philosophical approach influence your ways of doing inquiry? What does this philosophical approach make thinkable or possible for inquiry? And what are your perspectives on methodologies and methods, and how do you envision that in your approaches to doing inquiry? So those are often quite useful questions because they essentially ask us to think about ontologies and epistemologies. And I didn't want to say too much about ontology and epistemology. So I'm going to highlight 5 areas that I thought I want to speak about briefly in terms of the 3 presentations by Gina U, Gina L, and Katja. So I mean, I think what is quite significant is that in all three presentations, there was a focus on the body. Uh, um, and embodiment, and what it enables us to do in context of radical healing. There was a visceral and perhaps emotive response to the presentations, which may have allowed us present here to connect with the presenters, but also to engage us in our own critical reflexivity based on what resonated for us personally in our own work and experience. And so that is very valuable as well when we work. I mean, there's a lot written by feminist writers on embodiment precisely because it becomes such a powerful tool. And I'll say a little bit more about that when I talk about methodology. The other aspect that is different from, your traditional presentations, some of which I do too, is the focus on emotion. And this is often obscured in research, but according to Michalinos Zembelis, who has written extensively on emotion in learning, it's crucial to our learning and can act as a catalyst for change. And so we've seen some of what you've done in your work in terms of well-being and radical healing, how emotion becomes part of that catalyst. Right? Gina L., you were disgruntled when you thought about your presentation, when you thought about how am I going to teach these undergraduate students? How am I going to do this differently? It's often an emotive response that brings about what it is that we want to do differently. But also, the presentations evoke, and particularly performative presentations evoke emotion. So in praxis, Gina L., Gina U., and Kacha all demonstrated how theory and practice are mutually constitutive, but moreover, how these understandings inform meaningful practices of potential repair. And I'm saying potential repair in violent times. I think that was central theme for me. And that I think what is really important as well about theory and practice is that not one of the two are in a hierarchical relationship to each other. They are mutually constitutive, so that's really important, praxis. Then in terms of context and reflexivity, they are core to these presentations. Who are my students? What are the contexts in which they find themselves? What can we do to facilitate repair in communities in contexts of violence? What are the contexts of violence? Who am I in relation to my environment, Gina, you? And the histories and institutional contexts that are evoked. What do images from the environment and the material world evoke? So those are really important to think about when one does this kind of work. And then finally, methodologies. I think one of the core issues that there's been lots of critique about is in terms of PQ, post-qualitative research, is the way in which methodology is often becomes so ritualized, especially through in the context of institutional boards that we all know very well, that in fact it makes some innovative and work that pushes the boundaries, creative work, very hard to do. So in these three presentations, I thought the methodologies employed are disruptive, that they trouble the normativity of method and practice in psychology. That the methodologies and methods allow for us to engage with repair, and in order to repair, perhaps we need to unlearn, not forget, but unlearn in order to expand our learning and to reshape who we are through our research, which is important in community regeneration. Because in short, it's about a reclaiming of who we are and who our communities are in terms of histories, traditions, and that which has been erased. And so often, visual, performative, art-based work, poetry become useful methods, so to speak, of doing some of this work that is often done in partnership, through partnership with communities. So thanks very much. That's all I want to say about this presentation.
Thank you so much, Ronel, for those comments. And now we have some time for Q&A, and the session is being streamed. So if you have a question, I'll bring the microphone to you. Yeah, Doug.
Great job, all four of you. I really got a lot out of this. My question is, I know that it's possible for the kind of bodily and psychological healing and resilience to lead to activism and resistance, but I'm wondering if any of you could speak to how to encourage that, rather than the possibility that it could, resilience can sometimes just lead to acceptance and passivity.
Did you have a hard time hearing the question, or? Oh, so the question was, can you hear me okay? Okay. Oh, you would like to respond to it? You have another question. Okay. Okay, I'll call on you next to see if anybody wants to respond to Doug's question.
I've recently, because I'm not in the field of community psychology or psychology, but I've recently come to learn or distinguish between resilience and critical resilience. And the resilience that can kind of lead to a passivity or being okay with whatever, horrible things might be happening is not the same as a critical resilience, in which I don't even want to divide, but individual wellness and social wellness are combined, bridges the gap between my own autonomous, physical resilience and the health of the world. So there is no way to separate, I'd say, under Irma Serrano Garcia writes about this, between my own healing and the healing of the circumstances that have caused the damage in the first place. And so that's where in my work, for instance, the physical work isn't just about breathing, being okay right now, whatever is happening. It's about connecting and observing and noticing how far am I sitting from you? Why am I here and you're there? What's the difference? What is the impact of my surroundings? Very physical. How high is the ceiling? To social, political. Can I come and sit right next to you or not, and why? What's happening in the world? So I think there's I think that's my answer. I think I've said enough.
Maybe I can just add something. There's a very interesting paper on this very issue that was published in the latest journal of global community psychology on this whole question of resilience, because you're absolutely correct. Resilience can be can contribute to pathologizing, to despair, to apathy, to alienation. You're absolutely correct. So there's an interesting discussion about it in the recent journal.
I think for me also an important part of a healing justice framework is that when we are really in touch with our experiences and reactions, that will propel us into action as well, right? So it's not about numbing, it's about being in touch so that we can use that cold anger some people talk about. So that's like the IAF, the Industrial Areas Foundation model, to propel action instead of to stop it. So I would just add that.
I'm actually not in psychology either, but I'm coming from anthropology and from the arts. But my commentary on resilience would come from the way it has been misused in terms of characterizing minoritized folks for being able to sort of put up with all sorts of structural inequities, and our ability to keep going is misread, right, as resilient. And I write a lot about Haiti, where, I mean, if there's one country that they're always talking about Haitian resilience, you know, no matter what happens, the Haitian people bounce back. And it's the way it's also used to sort of de-emphasize the impact of all these global structural conditions.
Yes, and Katya is in dance, by the way, so that we know. We all started at Wesleyan at the same time, and now we have to get Katya to Santa Cruz.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation and for creating this space that we are connected with our bodies, emotions, and I think this powerful space. And we'd like to know the challenges that you face to facilitate these activities in white institutions with hegemonic knowledge. And I suppose that, I don't know, you could be like defense reactions or like some avoids. And if you could share with us the journey that you did to be situated in this position now, to use these strategies for creating this environment, this space, this atmosphere, and if you can do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody want to take that? I know you do. I was just going to hand this to you, but I didn't want to.
I think, but you know, so here's what's really, I think, a thing to note here. The three of us, we were at Wesleyan University together. In 2001, we met. So we're old friends. In 2001, assistant professors. And I'm just going to give you this bit. We were in a room where we were making so much eye contact over what was being said, like we knew we were going to be friends, right? And this is psychology, anthropology, dance. And so we've done one of these conferences many years before. And so I just want to give you that as the background, that the fact that we're each other's interlocutors. Like, what does it mean that we're in these different disciplines, trained so differentially, yet we were able to engage and have been engaging for almost 20 years. This is, I mean, we were like, of course we're going to Italy, Gina. We're coming to your conference, of course. But that's something to be said in terms of professionally thinking about who are your interlocutors. And oftentimes we think we need to stay within our disciplinary boundaries, and clearly that's not the case. I can tell you very honestly that when I started to do this, and I started to do this in 2001 when it was not hip, I've had people say, why are you performing in an academic setting, right? And then I'm like, oh, aren't we all performers? It's the academy, everybody performs. The thing is though, because I'm in anthropology, and my advisor was Ruth Behar, who did work in reflexive anthropology. So I have a history then of sort of being somewhat marginal, because I think reflexive anthropology has been embraced by Denson and Lincoln. I mean, I use that anthology, that huge handbook for my classes in a way that it wasn't as appreciated in anthropology. So there's this aspect, like this thread in anthropology had a bigger home in psychology and other disciplines than it had within cultural anthropology, where it was seen as navel gazing, where it was seen as too subjective. But this was in the 2000s, and like 20 years later, things have changed a lot. I think another thing I'll say is what it means to be strategic professionally, to make decisions. I'm gonna just jump and say I'm a full professor, like whatever. What I was always concerned about was the work that I do was not going to recreate the order that I'm speaking of and I'm questioning. So my commitment to praxis has determined the type of work that I've done. And I really appreciate you noting, Renelle noting that she could see clearly that between praxis and theory, we did not uphold a hierarchy. And that's a lot of work, right? That's training, and then, but also a mindfulness and a commitment to social justice. I think the thing is I believe that space exists in the academy. I think you kind of have to keep looking for it if it's not readily in front of you. And so that's one of the things I've done. I can always talk to you afterwards, but I don't want to overtake too much time.
I can just add a strategic. I think I was very fortunate to grow up in a context around a lot of artists, right? And then I was fortunate to have Patty Lather as a professor, and helped me to make the connection that in some way art, it's a sneak. Nobody can tell you what art is. Methodologically, I have a lot of leeway. I do what I feel is important, and then I learned strategically the language to connect it to methodology. So Patty Lather's methodology is a becoming, should anybody ask what I'm doing? Well, it's art, it's a sneak. I haven't reflected on it well enough yet to know if it's, in what ways that's problematic. But methodology is, in the university is a ritual. It is so rigid, and to be able to do things and then name my own methodology, it was a sneak. It might have been a cheat, but here I am. And
I agree with you. And at the same time, there's a way that the arts gets feminized a lot, right? So it's like what it means to sort of like be mindfully present and aware that you're deploying, these tools that are just differentially positioned within an academic context that prioritizes enlightened reason, for example. However, we all know, and I think that's the point about doing embodied presence work, that once you tell somebody, take a deep breath, you know how deep your lungs, you know how far your lungs go, you've changed the conversation, right? Because the academy just needs you to not be a body. All you are is your mind. Yet there's no mind without this physical thing. So I think when we do that, it kind of forces us to sort of, it asks of us to just remember there's more of us in the room, right? All of us are in the room.
Yeah. I think the question that always comes up in this context, which is an extension of your question, is really now, how do you teach this?
Yeah.
And I think that is a huge challenge, precisely because I will tell you, I will not do this with my students in honors, which is a 4th year or master's, and a colleague of mine at my neighboring university does a lot of this work with doctoral students only. But then she sends them to Rosie Braidotti Summer School, for example. This kind of work needs it's a different language that you have to acquire. It's a different language you have to acquire. It's a totally different school of thinking, if I can put it that way, because they say they're not a paradigm. So I'll call it's a different school of thinking. And so I would be very careful. I will introduce different ways of talking about embodied work or visual methodologies, but I'll never talk about post-qualitative work to my honors and postgraduate master students.
I would say for me, a couple of things. One, I want to just underscore what's been said and also say if any of you have read my piece in American Journal of Community Psychology, the love letter to budding scholar activists, Gina Yu is the reason that paper is as it is, because I gave her an early version and she was like, no, this is not ready for prime time. You need to do some major revisions. And anytime I feel stuck, I envision Katya saying, wave your hands in the air. And I wave my hands and she goes, how come none of us ever wave like this? Do you remember this? I haven't told you this. How come none of us ever wave like this? Right? Because that's telling us like the ways that even the ways that we move our bodies has been socially constructed. Like I know it was like a non-moment for you. It was a very important moment for me. This is the first time Katya is hearing this. And in terms of my class, I do get resistance, and what I do about it, and maybe I'm able to do this, given my own positionality, it's usually white men who are like, what are we doing? And so I will start out with saying, like we're going to have pauses in this class. And some of you are going to be uncomfortable with that. And what I want you to recognize, if you are uncomfortable, I want you to reflect on why you are uncomfortable, right? So I give these instructions beforehand. Some of us need the pause to think, and we're not given that time. So we're going to take the pause. And if you are like feeling super like this is awkward, I'm feeling anxious, think about that and why you might be feeling that way. So I really open it that way in my classes. And then in another class, I have this handout, which I had to create because the students were like, I don't understand what's happening. So there are questions like, when you're watching this city council meeting, how do you feel? They're like, what do you mean? How do I feel? I'm like, are you bored? Are you hungry? Are you anxious? Are you angry? Like, what knowledge is your body holding that you could be tuning into and learning from? And then they're like, oh, I was bored, right? It was like, first, well, what is that signaling to you? Why do you think you might be bored? What are you learning from that moment by being bored? And once I made the handout, then it was like, oh, okay, got it. But if I was just like, attend to your body, what is it telling you? It was like, I don't even know what you're, saying to me. Mm-hmm.
And can I just say one thing? Because I think, just thinking back with, Katya and I were having breakfast this morning. A lot of the work we're doing is with, and also whether it's in the classroom, food insecurity and so forth, it's about people's lives and people are on the front line. I mean, and I think, a big part of what drives us individually and then collectively, which is how we ended up bonding, is the recognition that this is about saving lives, right? And there's a point to rhetoric, there's a point to these conversations, but ultimately, Ukraine is at war. Haiti right now has been under lockdown again. There's been all of these strikes at the university. I mean, we now both work at a university where the day-to-day life of these students in one of the wealthiest counties in California, you would never know how bad it actually is because it's not proper conversation, right? So there's all these things that tend to be relegated to, we're not going to have this and we're interested in talking about these violences precisely because we're trying to save our lives and other people's lives.
I think we have time for one more quick one. I'm telling us up here, we have to be quick if there's another one question. Do any of you have questions for any of? Okay, great. Then thank you so much for coming.